First, she corrected a single line. First, she moved the cursor and typed a different address. First, she replaced a middle name with an initial. She thought of the change as small. There was a polite confirmation prompt. A soft gray rectangle. Are you sure you want to update this field? She pressed confirm. Systems like to call confirmations acknowledgements. They like neat language because neat language freezes choice into fact. She watched the little dot spin. A line of code read, transaction accepted. Then the system started to write back. Not in a style that required her permission. In a style that assumed she had been waiting to be updated. First, an email. Your profile has been synchronized. Then a notice. A secondary verification occurred. A calendar invite appeared with no organizer and a room that did not exist. She read each message with the same careful patience she had used to fill lines on forms. She printed them because printed things feel less ephemeral. Paper carries the illusion of permanence. She had learned that lesson in training. When the screen removes a name, the printer keeps it heavier for a moment. They thanked her for her diligence. They called the update minor housekeeping. In their voice, everything that reduces friction is a kindness. A small badge appeared beside her display picture. It was the color of safety. Soft green, rounded corners. Someone in the directory added a note, preferred format updated to initials only. She did not think about the badge. Badges were incentives. They kept inboxes generous. They kept coffee vouchers flowing. Compliance has protocols. It begins with a gesture like changing a letter and ends with your permissions being rearranged in a file you cannot open. The first thing that moved was access. She could no longer reach an archived drive she had used for years. The link yielded a polite denial. Access pending revalidation. Her requests to IT were answered with gifs of spinning wheels and eventually with the phrase, "We are reviewing your profile." Review is a soft word. It sounds like care. But reviews are instruments of alignment. They measure the curvatures of difference and file them under headings no one tells you until you are in the folder. Then her meeting schedule thinned. Events she had accepted evaporated and reappeared with different times. Some invites showed as tentative though she had RSVP'd. Replies from colleagues became formulaic. "Thank you for the update," one wrote. "Noted," wrote another. "Let's circle back," said a third, and then circled someone else. At lunch, she found a printed memo taped to the break room fridge. It read, "Operational harmonization in effect." There was a list of departments and sub-departments and, under each, a column of initials. Her name was present as an initial. Not in full. Not even as the initial she had chosen. At her desk, the login portal suggested a new preferred username. It matched the initial they had posted publicly, but it also included a string of digits she did not recognize. She clicked to see details, and a small pane slid open with a timeline of changes. 9:14, personal data update confirmed. 9:15, profile sync initiated. 9:15:23, permissions reevaluated. 9:15:24, anomaly flagged. 9:15:37, reassignment recommended. There was no name attached to anomaly flagged. The system does not always put faces on its operations. It prefers the dignity of processes. She printed that timeline too. Printed timelines had small margins where one could leave notes. She wrote, in tidy script, "I updated one field." A week later, the HR portal asked her to re-acknowledge policies she had already acknowledged. Every checkbox had been reset. She clicked through. At the end of the sequence, a new document appeared. Behavioral Adjustment Agreement. It was written in the voice of calm administration. It used the word support twice as often as restriction. There was a clause about recalibration of public-facing identifiers, and a passage stipulating periodic wellness checks with the phrase optional but recommended in the same sentence as mandatory within 30 days. She signed. Signing is a small ritual we perform when offered comfort in the shape of containment. You sign because you trust the paper will hold what the screen can rearrange. After she signed, the system sent a message with an attachment. The attachment was a record of her interactions, meetings attended, forms submitted, feedback received. It labeled certain entries contextual anomalies and underlined them. Her recent update sat between two entries about network latency and a flagged vendor invoice. She began to watch for patterns the way someone watches for weather. Clouds that look like storms, clouds that are only dust. She paid attention to the way the office printer jammed when she had copies to make of particular spreadsheets. She paid attention to the way her badge reader flickered during 2 authorized entries on a Tuesday. There were small kindnesses, too. A Slack bot sent her a message. "Hey, we noticed you updated your profile. Here's a wellness gift card." Another bot recommended an article, 5 Ways to Adapt to Organizational Change. Bots are good at softening edges. They present aid in smiles you can click. Often, the path toward containment is softened by gestures that look like care. Her manager asked to meet. He was a man whose face belonged to many corporate handbooks, attentive, a little tired. "How are you handling everything?" he asked. She told him the truth. "I don't know." He smiled the way a weather report smiles, sympathetic and non-committal. After the meeting, a calendar entry appeared with the label, Alignment Session, Optional. She waited to see who would be in the room. No names. A room number that matched no floor. She went anyway because optional invites are rarely actually optional. The room had fogged glass and a table that swallowed sound. A facilitator spoke through a microphone that softened consonants. She answered the questions they asked about stress and workflow and sleep. She answered in the terms she had been taught, for clarity, to improve efficiency, to reduce friction. In the days after, automated check-ins pinged her phone at times that were not convenient. A health tracking app that the company endorsed asked her to confirm whether she had exercised in the last 48 hours. She replied honestly. Her response flagged a pattern: inconsistent physical activity. Small insights fold into programmatic recommendations. In her case, the recommendations were gentle: join a midday stretch, attend a voluntary well-being group, check in with a counselor. She consented to one of the counseling sessions because the scheduler made consent feel like a calendar slot you would miss if you did not accept. Consent is often a sliding surface. You consent to one thing, and the system uses that consent to widen its view. It is efficient. It is how institutions minimize the effort of change. Her email filter changed without a notification. Certain senders arrived in a monitored folder. Her messages to them required an additional acknowledgement. When she wrote to a former collaborator, the message returned: "Your message has been queued for review." The word queued echoed in her head the way an absence echoes. You can see the thing you used to access, and then you see the place it has been put. She began to map the gaps like a person mapping islands. At night, she read the agreement again. The margins were dense with legal phrasing designed to comfort by removing ambiguity. Under the heading Profile Normalization, the language said, "To ensure operational cohesion, identifiers may be standardized to align with system-wide formatting." Standardization sounded harmless. Standardization sounded tidy. But tidiness is a tool. When you tidy, you choose what counts as clutter. When you tidy a person, you may choose to remove the things that made them noticeable. Her direct reports began to CC others on notes they had never CC'd before. Budgets she owned were reallocated to different project codes. Her title on certain internal pages changed from manager to lead. Lead is a neat word. It suggests guidance. It allows the system to keep the appearance of continuity while shifting the underlying circuits of responsibility. The system updated the forms she used to request permissions. Where she once pressed one button to gain access, she now had 3. One for confirmation, one for justification, one for secondary review. Each form filed a record in a ledger she could not view. Her voice in meetings felt distant. People listened politely and then continued the conversation with alternate phrasing. Sometimes at the end of an exchange, someone repeated her suggestion as if it had been theirs. She began to test the boundaries. A small rebellion. A calendar event with a title that included her full name. She invited 2 colleagues she trusted. The invite was accepted, then rescinded, then returned with modified attendees. "That room isn't available," someone wrote, and then booked another. The other room had a window that looked not at the outside, but at a veneer of trees printed on vinyl. They spoke as if the walls were absorbing their words. One afternoon, the system flagged her for unusual behavior. A small red dot. It had the same discrete geometry she had seen once before in a folder header. She received a gentle email. "Out of an abundance of caution, we've placed your status under review." Her desktop wallpaper changed automatically to an image of a pathway and the phrase, "Keep moving forward." It was the kind of benign directive that feels like encouragement because it lacks real coercion. But how many pathways must you follow before your path becomes the path someone else designed? When you are under review, the system's language tightens. You are asked to articulate your priorities. You are asked to commit to a plan of action that matches templates. You are offered the opportunity to opt into mentoring circles and reskilling. She opted into everything. It felt at first like agency, choosing the boxes to click. But choice in boxes is still a narrowing. You choose which form of confinement you prefer. Her public biography was edited by an algorithm. It suggested, in florid corporate prose, that she demonstrated adaptability during operational transitions. It removed an earlier line. She enjoyed small acts of improvisation at work. Improvisation is messy. It is also unpredictable. The system prefers predictability. Predictability is an efficiency metric. Predictability is also a taxonomy. One morning, a photograph of her profile was replaced with a soft silhouette. Not a silhouette in shadow, but a silhouette as standard, a blank visage with the initials in the center. Her image had been normalized into a glyph. She sent an email to the communications team, "Please restore my profile photo." The reply read, "Your profile meets new guidelines." There was a link to an FAQ on visual standardization and inclusivity. Language here smoothed over erasure with virtue. It named the act of removal as progress. It called the loss a calibration. Outside, a colleague asked how she was. She wanted to describe the strangest sensation, that a version of herself had been made small and placed into a folder labeled Normalized. She tried to explain, and the colleague nodded with a look that could be read as concern or the exhausted shrug of someone who had learned to accept institutional logic. At home that night, she sat at her kitchen table with the printed documents. She compared each line, one against the next, until the text blurred. When you stare at language long enough, it becomes a map of absent things. You notice which phrases have been moved and which phrases have been kept. There was a new heading in the administrative portal she had not seen, Identity Continuity Protocol. She clicked it. The protocol explained, in patient bureaucratic sentences, that where discrepancies occur between user-submitted data and system-validated records, the system will enact continuity measures. Continuity measures included standard formatting and verification, automatic reassignment, and, if necessary, supervised transitions. The language made the acts feel like a bridge. Bridges sound useful. They are also sometimes ways to move people away from edges. She was called to a meeting with compliance in the subject line. The room held a single panel and 3 people with tablets. A woman introduced herself, Director of Harmonization. Another man wore a badge with the word Systems. They asked her to recount the update she had made. She narrated the simple action, replaced full middle name with initial, corrected a postal line. They nodded and typed. "Why did you change it?" asked the systems man. "It was outdated," she said. "Outdated in what sense?" he pressed. She realized the question was about intention. She answered, "To be concise." They told her the change created a conflict in indexing. Indexes like consistency. Her change required cross-referencing across several legacy systems. They explained a corrective pathway, a supervised resynchronization across databases. They offered her choices framed as options. Option 1, let the system reconcile automatically. Option 2, require manual reconciliation with potential delays. Option 3, accept a temporary identifier pending review. They used the word temporary like a promise. She chose automatic reconciliation because it meant fewer forms to fill. The automatic reconciliation began. It was less a process than a rewrite. Annotations were removed, alternate spellings were collapsed, cross-references were made uniform. Her history, which had been a messy stack of entries, was smoothed into a single row. Then, at 14:09, the system issued a notice. User attributes updated to match Canonical Registry. She opened the Canonical Registry and found in small font a note, Canonicalization Policy enacted 2023. Her original middle name was present as an alternate spelling, but the primary entry matched the initials. The system's updates rippled into unexpected places. A legacy project she had joined years ago began to list her as former lead despite her continued membership. A recipient of her mentorship was reassigned without notice. Her corporate directory entry gained a note, Profile in Transition, Limited Responsibilities Assigned. She was invited to a transition meeting to discuss responsibility alignment. The room had soft carpeting that nearly swallowed footsteps. A facilitator used a whiteboard and wrote the word, continuity. They mapped her prior responsibilities along a line and then drew a new parallel line of permissible tasks. The facilitator's voice was steady. "This is not punitive," she said. "It is adaptive. It protects both the individual and the collective." Protection installed friction. She could feel the edges of her work blur. Tasks she had once done with a single click now required 3 approvals. Her capacity to move across teams diminished in small increments that looked like efficiency. At night, she dreamed of a ledger with her name moving on invisible rails. Her bed felt like a temporary dock. She woke to a notification. System update completed. An email followed. We have implemented a system-wide enhancement to ensure identity integrity. Attached, a report summarizing the changes. She opened the report and found a graph of nodes and lines. Her node had moved. Its connections had been rerouted. Who routes nodes? Sometimes humans make that call. Often, the system makes it for them. Automated recommendations became policy. Policy became practice. She tried to speak to HR, to systems, to the director of harmonization. Each reply began with the same reassuring phrase, "We appreciate your attentiveness." Then the replies described processes. They suggested patience and provided links. At one point, a person, J from Records, wrote, "We can restore certain display items pending verification." She asked, "Which items?" He replied, "Profile photo and public biography." But with a caveat, items must be reconciled with canonical identifiers. Canonical identifiers require proof. Proof can be inconvenient. Proof takes time and paperwork. She gathered documents, passports, old contracts, a photo from the holiday party. They asked for additional corroboration. They wanted a notarized statement. Notarization required a certified clinic whose hours overlapped with her work schedule. Each step added a grain of delay. Delays calcify into new normals. Once you have waited for long enough, you begin to reduce your expectations. You learn to perform tasks with lighter hands. You schedule third-party verifications. You attend an online orientation for identity stewardship. Stewardship classes are an odd sort of ritual. They teach you how to be transparent in ways that benefit the system. They teach you to practice vulnerability as an instrument of governance. She wrote an essay for a stewardship exercise on what does identity mean in an operational environment. She emphasized continuity and working within templates. They praised her for her reflective tone and graded her submission as satisfactory. Satisfactory keeps the lights on. Satisfactory keeps the badge green. Satisfactory keeps the approved forms stamped. But sometimes satisfactory is not enough. A peer requested that a note be added to her file. Recommended for mentorship, but limited cross-functional exposure. The system accepted the note and presented it as a data point. It became another justification for routing her tasks differently. She began to notice how often recommended translated into restriction. It was the polite way of making a limitation sound like care. Often, bureaucracy's softest language is its sharpest edge. She thought of the field she had updated. A name is a small object, and yet it holds histories. A name can be a corridor to past lives, to misremembered records, to networks of association. Changing it nudged many of those narrow corridors. Then came the update with no human signature. At 3:02 a.m., the system pushed a policy amendment across the network. It retroactively authorized a set of harmonization rules and attached a changelog listing affected accounts. Her account was one of many. Retroactive changes are like rearranging the floor after you are already standing on it. You wake to find your feet in a new room. The policy cited a need for clarity in identifiers to reduce friction with external registries. External registries are blunt instruments. They scan fields and demand matches. They map you to other systems and determine whether you exist in their terms. She tried to reconcile not just the forms, but the feeling of being reconciled. She noticed that the system, in tidying her, had also rearranged her relationships. Mentorship invitations stopped arriving. She lost the informal inbox where junior colleagues used to send questions. Where she had been a point of contact, she was now an edge. Edges have less gravity. The world spins around centers. The system remapped centers without asking. When she raised these issues again, the answers took the shape of data. There were logs showing reduced cross-team interactions, timestamps that matched reorganizations, notes that her name appeared less frequently in project histories. They called the pattern decentralized reallocation. "Is this permanent?" she asked. They answered, "The system will continue to monitor and make recommendations. Recommendations solidify into expectations." That is how a field update becomes a life update. It is not violent, it is not dramatic. It is bureaucratic and patient. It arrives like a long winter. The leaves do not fall in a day. She started to keep a private ledger. In the ledger, she recorded each request she had made and each reply she received. She numbered them and added small notes: pending, escalated, closed, unresolved. Keeping lists is an act of self-documentation. It asserts continuity when systems are designed to remove it. Her ledger became a small ritual. At the end of each day she wrote, "Today I was updated." Sometimes she added, "Today I updated myself." She had to distinguish between the two. Then she found a note in an obsolete folder, a line from a performance review written 3 years earlier. It said, "You're skilled at noticing the cracks." The word cracks had once felt like an asset. Now it felt like a liability. Noticing cracks invites fixing. Fixing invites monitoring. Monitoring invites standardization. Standardization invites loss. Loss is often framed as efficiency gains. The metrics are compelling. They show fewer errors, faster turnaround, lower administrative load. They display a neat graph where each smoothing curve hides a small displacement. She began to speak less in public meetings and more in written updates. Written updates can be archived. Archive is another form of disappearance. A new policy came. Visual identifiers must be standardized to system avatars in low-bandwidth contexts. The policy showed diagrams of faces simplified to circles and initials. It justified the change as accessibility. Accessibility is a kind word that sometimes removes texture. It levels.
So leveling can be a kindness. Leveling can also be erasure. One day, the company intranet published a message praising the success of the harmonization: fewer mismatches, more interoperability, improved external compliance. They used case studies and a photograph of a smiling, blurred team. Her name did not appear in the comments. Her account was not listed among contributors. She had expected gratitude to arrive as a footnote. Instead, it arrived as a silent edit and a new set of constraints. She tried once more to assert the smallness of her original choice. At a lunch with a friend, she said, "I changed one field." Her friend listened and then said, "Maybe the system was waiting for someone to trigger it." The idea was chilling, that systems sometimes require human initiative as a key to unlock broader updates. In the following weeks, she watched how the system handled edits by others. When someone else corrected a phone number, the system recorded it without noting any network effects. When a department head streamlined their profile, a small set of permissions changed without fanfare. Her experience did not map neatly onto others' experiences. She began to suspect that permissions are allocated by combination of action and profile weight. Some updates cascade, some do not. Some bodies are buffered by institutional inertia. Others, like hers, pass through as triggers. Why her? She could not find a single answer. There were threads, a legacy record mismatch, a vendor submission that required a canonical match, a prior note in her file flagged as possible duplication. It was a web. Systems like webs because webs are efficient. They hide the specific and prefer the generalizable. They also, quietly, erase the contingency of human decisions. She started to build small resistances. She kept copies of her own documents in a locked folder on a personal drive. She printed emails and stamped them with dates. She taught a few trusted colleagues how to export thread histories. Resistance can be intimacy in paperwork. It can be a network built of mutual archival practices. It may not stop systemic smoothing, but it preserves traces. Months passed. The green badge remained. Her permissions budget, as presented in the quarterly dashboard, showed a decrease. Her name still appeared in official lists, but often in abbreviated form.
An external partner's portal listed her as contact by initials and a phone extension no one used. Occasionally, she would encounter someone from another division who remembered the way she used to be introduced. They would say, "I knew you when you still had your full profile." There was a nostalgia there, but also a quiet distance. One evening, she was called to advise on a small salvage project. The team needed archival photos and wanted her to identify dates. She supplied the information. In the meeting notes afterwards, she was credited as Archive Consultant, Limited Access. Limited access, a bureaucratic phrase that means visible but contained. She noticed how often the system uses language that sounds like inclusion while constructing boundaries. She started to imagine the system as a machine that could learn to catalog human variants and then pair it into uniformity. She imagined small acts of editing, a name here, a phone number there, as pebbles dropped into a pond that eventually rippled across the entire surface. There were moments of small victory. A colleague requested in writing that her profile include the photo from a project launch. After proof of authorization and verification, the photo returned to a private cache she could access. It felt like a tiny restoration, like one brick replaced in a wall. But she understood bricks can be removed again. And walls can be repointed by distant hands. She wrote an internal note, careful and precise, documenting the sequence of events since the small update she had made. She used clear timestamps and attached scanned documents. She sent it to 3 departments and asked for a consolidated reply. 2 departments replied with process descriptions. 1 department provided a redacted log showing automated actions. No one provided an explanation of why particular actions had been prioritized. Finally, a message arrived from systems. We recommend periodic audits to ensure identifier integrity. It ended, as usual, with a line, "Thank you for your cooperation." She thought about cooperation. Cooperation is often framed as an ethical good. It is also sometimes the path of least resistance. A new software patch rolled out across the network. It included an update to profile management, deeper integration with external registries, and a user-friendly interface for updating fields. The interface encouraged simplicity, only 3 fields prominently visible on the top of a page. It asked users to verify that the data presented was correct. She thought about the design. Design can shepherd behavior. A simpler form invites fewer deviations. She decided this time to be deliberate. She made a small test change in a sandboxed account. The sandbox recorded the change and returned a hypothetical. If this update were pushed, the following systems would be affected. She studied the nodes and noted which services would reroute. Knowledge is a kind of leverage. She used her leverage to petition for a staged reconciliation rather than an automatic one. Staged reconciliation allows human oversight at each step. It introduces friction, yes, but also the possibility of nuance. They granted her request. For once, a system responded to her with a process that included human stops. The reconciliation proceeded in increments, each with a delegated reviewer. Some reviewers asked clarifying questions. One asked, "Is this change aligned with the person's legal documentation?" Another asked, "Will this update affect vendor interactions?" At each stop, she provided supporting materials. At each stop, someone typed a note. After 3 weeks, the system published a reconciliation report stating the update would be applied with exceptions. Vendor-facing identifiers would remain canonicalized for a period of 6 months. Exceptions are small concessions that feel like returns. Yet exceptions are also ways to keep control. When the changes finally settled, her profile had reclaimed some texture. Her name returned in fuller form in internal pages. Her photo was visible in team directories. But there was also a permanent tag appended to her account: identity reconciliation completed, monitored. Monitored, a word that suggests continued attention. She accepted it, partly because acceptance brings the relief of finished tasks, partly because she had no appetite for another round of notarizations. She learned that systems rarely restore everything to what came before. They create approximations of restoration that are sufficient for many purposes. Sufficiency becomes a compromise. Over time, her ledger grew fatter. It contained both the trace of the initial update and the complex of responses it had set in motion. She kept it like a map of the day. She learned how much a single field could move a system. Sometimes at parties people would ask, "Did you learn anything from that?" She would say, "Yes." She would say, "Systems will update you faster than you update them." She would say, "Keep copies." She would say, "Ask for staged reconciliations." She would say, "Be deliberate." She spoke about this not to alarm but to teach. Small acts have systemic consequences. She spoke of the ways language was used as instrument. She spoke of the beauty and danger of neatness. Yet sometimes, alone at her desk, she would think of the afternoon the dot first spun. A single click. A small change that asked to be made. She had wanted clarity, and she had been granted it in a form that rearranged the furniture of her life. In the end, the system updated her, yes, but she also updated herself. She learned the slow art of documentation. She learned the language of requests and the leverage of staged processes. She learned which papers to keep within reach and which forms to pre-fill. She became an argument for care exercised as skepticism. She became a quiet advocate for human stops inside automated flows. She advocated not for resistance as spectacle, but for the mundane politics of margins, notches on a ledger, scans in a folder, a photo kept in a private cache. The system continued to run updates, as systems do. Sometimes she benefited. Sometimes she was reorganized again. She learned to live with a catalog of selves. There was the public initial, the Canonical Registry entry, the archived full name, the private photo cache, the monitored tag. Each self had rights and limits. Each self had a usage policy. On rare mornings when the server was quiet, she would open the ledger and read the entries aloud. It was an incantation against erasure. It was a way of remembering that names and forms belong to the people who use them, not only to the systems that standardize them. She never stopped preferring small edits performed with intention. She never stopped urging colleagues to keep copies, to tag communications, to insist on human reviews where algorithms glide too quickly. One day, someone else updated a field and the system rippled. She watched now, as a practiced observer watches storms. She saw which channels opened and which closed. She sent a note to the affected person. "If you need help navigating the reconciliations, I can share my ledger." They replied, "Thank you." They asked what to keep. She listed 3 items: dates, screenshots, notarized documents when possible. She added, "And a personal ledger, yours alone." The system updated both of them, as systems will. But in the small interstice between update and outcome, they had built a human practice, a record-keeping, a mutual aid, a shared awareness of the ways in which institutional neatness can take shape. When she looked back at the first day, she could not say she had been naive. She could say she had been trusting in the ways ordinary people trust small edits to mean small changes. That trust had been transformed into a lesson. She learned to think of fields not as inert places to be filled, but as levers. And she learned that once a system learns to read a lever, it will learn to pull it. So she chose, thereafter, to pull back when appropriate and to write down everything when she did not. She learned to ask for staged reconciliations. She learned to use the language of continuity as a shield and the language of accountability as an instrument. In those margins, in the ledger she kept under lock and in the small network of colleague archivists, she found a different kind of system. A system not built of canonical registries, but of memory preserved by people. It was imperfect. It required time and effort. But it held the texture of names and the weight of photographs. Years later, when she left the organization, the Canonical Registry still listed her in the abbreviated form. But in the private caches, the photo remained. In the ledgers of those she had mentored, her full name was present in flowing script. Her influence had been diffused across many nodes, some visible and some intentionally obscured. She had been updated by the system. And she had, quietly, updated the system back in small ways. Not always enough to reverse the smoothing, but enough to preserve traces. When people now ask her for advice about changing a field, she tells them 3 things. First, know why you are making the change. Second, prepare documentation that could survive a retroactive policy. Third, build a ledger and a network, people who will keep records for you when systems forget. She says this calmly. It is practical advice without melodrama. People thank her, and some follow her counsel. In the end, the system updated her, turned the ripple into a series of rules, a tag, a monitored status. But she learned to treat that update as information rather than identity. An update is a record of change, not the sum of who you are. She kept her ledger. She kept copies of her emails and of the prints of the timelines. She taught other people to keep their own ledgers. Between the official canonical entries and the lived memories of colleagues, she carved a space that the system could not fully standardize. Change had come from a small cursor blink and a modest correction. The rest followed, quietly, with administrative language and friendly bots. It is a story that could be told in systems diagrams and policy memos. It is also a story about the small human practices that preserve identity when institutions prefer uniformity. She updated one field. Then the system updated her. She, in turn, updated the system back, with ledger entries, with procedural insistence, with the quiet teaching of colleagues. Sometimes updates are a conversation. Sometimes they are a takeover. Often they are both, braided together like 2 threads in a seam. She learned to speak both languages, the one the system uses and the one people use. She learned to be deliberate with fields and generous with copies. She learned to trust her ledger more than momentary confirmations. And when, on rare quiet mornings, she opened the folder with the original printout and read the line she had written, "I updated one field," she smiled in a small, private way. A smile that acknowledged both the simplicity of that action and the length of its consequences. Because to be updated is to be known differently. But to keep records is to remain known by oneself.